This lecture covers the topic, We the People, and the focus question is, how did the definition of citizenship in the new republic exclude Native Americans and African Americans? Colonial Americans had been divided by ethnicity, religion, class, and status, and united only by their allegiance to Great Britain. The Revolution created a new collective body, the American people, whose members were to enjoy freedom as members of a new political community. Since government in the United States rested on the will of the people, establishing the identity of the people was important. The Constitution began with "We the People," but people did not include all those living within the United States. The Constitution identified three groups in the United States: Indians, who were treated as members of independent tribes and not part of the American nation; other persons, or slaves; and the people, the only group entitled to freedom in America. America at first seemed to offer a civic identity to all who dedicated themselves to America's political principles, but only certain groups of people were deemed citizens in the new nation. The way the early republic related to Indians and African Americans shows the contradictory principles shaping the American national identity. American leaders agreed that Western Indian lands should go to white Americans, but disagreed about which option was best for dealing with the Indian population: removal, disappearance, or assimilation into white civilization. Many Americans thought Indians unfit for citizenship. Indian tribes were not represented in the new government. The treaty system gave them the unique status of independent sovereign nations, but treaties, often signed by only a few unrepresentative members of a tribe, were essentially a means of transferring Indian land to the state or federal governments. Military conflict in the Old Northwest continued until 1794, when a U.S. victory led to the Treaty of Grenville the next year, which gave most of Ohio and Indiana to the U.S. government and established a system whereby tribes received annual grants of money at the cost of government interference in tribal affairs. Not all Americans believed that Indians were innately inferior to white Americans. Some, like Thomas Jefferson, believed they lived at a less advanced stage of civilization. In the 1790s, the federal government distributed agricultural tools and livestock to Indians and encouraged them to adopt American ways of life. The status of free blacks in the early republic was ambiguous. The Constitution did not initially define who are citizens of the United States, so individual states defined the boundaries of freedom. In some states, North and South, free blacks had some rights, including the right to vote, but the vast majority of blacks were enslaved, and slaves were not considered members of the nation or fully eligible for citizenship if free. Early immigration policy shows that Americans excluded blacks from their conception of who was an American. The Naturalization Act, passed by Congress in 1790, first defined American nationality by allowing only free white persons to emigrate and become citizens. Although some believe that this law initiated an open immigration policy, the word white in the law excluded the majority of mankind from coming to America and becoming citizens. John Locke had argued that liberty flowed from a man having the power of reason, and it did not seem a contradiction at this time to deny liberty to irrational beings. Increasingly, white Americans saw blacks as lacking the qualities that enabled freedom, self-control, reason, and allegiance to the larger community. Thomas Jefferson, in his Notes on the State of Virginia, published in 1785, claimed that blacks, because of their nature and experience of slavery, were disloyal to America, and he speculated that blacks were inherently inferior to whites. While he believed that Indians might have the capacity to become as civilized as whites, he did not believe blacks naturally had this capacity. While hoping for the end of slavery and opposing the slave trade, he also supported colonization, or the idea that blacks, once freed from slavery, could never fully be part of America and should be colonized in Africa or other parts of the Western Hemisphere. In his ambivalent approach to race and slavery, Jefferson reflected the thinking of his generation. While the decline of apprenticeship and indentured servitude expanded freedom for whites, the Revolution widened the divide between free Americans and enslaved Americans. Race now became a convenient justification for slavery in a nation dedicated to liberty. We the people increasingly meant only white Americans.